The wind had teeth in this part of the country. It bit through wool and leather, a constant, whining reminder that the land was king and men were merely tenants, their leases short and their comforts few. The mountains clawed at a sky the color of a washed-out pewter bowl, their peaks dusted with the first hard snow of the season. It was a beautiful country. If you had a taste for loneliness, a breathtaking, cruel expanse that could swallow a man whole and leave nothing behind but a ghost story whispered over a saloon fire. Eli guided his horse, Boulder, along the rutted track that passed for a road. The air was thin and sharp in his lungs. He was a man made of the same stark material as the landscape around him, weathered, quiet, and built to endure. His face was a map of long days under a punishing sun and longer nights under a cold blanket of stars. He did not seek company, and it did not seek him. Once every few months. However, necessity drove him from his isolated ranch cabin down to the muddy clutch of buildings they called Redemption. It was a name that always felt like a bitter joke. There was no redemption here, there was only survival. He hitched Boulder outside the general store, the sound of his boots on the warped boardwalk a heavy, deliberate thud. The air inside was thick with the smells of cured meat, kerosene, and damp wool. Silas, the store's proprietor, was leaning over the counter, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he spoke in a low tone to a pair of trappers. "Never should have come out here," Silas was saying, shaking his head. "Some women ain't built for it." The taller of the two trappers gave a harsh laugh. "Built for it? She was soft as fresh bread, Silas, and twice as useless. Pretty, I'll give her that, like one of them porcelain dolls from back east." Eli moved toward the back of the store, grabbing a sack of flour and another of beans. He did not mean to listen, but their words were like burrs, sticking to the quiet air. "What happened to her?" Silas asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and practiced indifference. "What do you think happened?" the second trapper grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Jedediah paid good money for her. Expected a wife, a worker, got a timid little church mouse who cried if he raised his voice. He got tired of it. So did the boys he owed money to." The words hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Eli felt a familiar tightening in his gut, a cold anger he had spent years trying to bury. He knew men like Jedediah, men who saw everything and everyone as something to be owned, used and discarded. "So she just ran off?" Silas pressed. "Disappeared a few days back." The tall trapper shrugged. "Jedediah ain't looking for her. Says the coyotes can have what's left. Said she was too strange. Anyhow, always staring at things that weren't there." Eli paid for his supplies in silence, his jaw set. He loaded the sacks onto his pack mule, the trapper's callous laughter following him out into the cold. He had seen it 100 times. Women came west chasing promises printed on cheap paper, dreams of a good husband and a piece of land, only to find themselves in a place that had no room for dreams, a place that broke soft things for sport. He was a few miles out of town, the trail to his cabin veering off from the main road, when Boulder suddenly shied, ears twitching. Eli pulled him to a halt, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his scabbard. He scanned the landscape, his eyes missing nothing. The skeletal remains of an old barn stood silhouetted against the gray sky, its roof caved in, its walls leaning like a tired old man. It was from there that the feeling came, a prickle of wrongness on the back of his neck. Dismounting, he tethered the horses to a skeletal pine and walked toward the derelict structure. The wind moaned through the gaps in the wood. He pushed aside what was left of a door and stepped into the gloom. The smell hit him first, sickness and despair. His eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the broken roof, and then he saw her. She was in the far corner, a small, huddled shape against a rotted support post. A heavy iron cuff was clasped around one ankle, the chain bolted to the wood. She was dressed in nothing but a thin, torn chemise that did little to ward off the bone-deep cold. Her skin was pale as milk, marred by a constellation of dark bruises that stood out like ink stains on parchment. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and straw. She was so still, so silent. He thought for a moment she was already gone. Then her head lifted, and her eyes met his. They were empty. It was not fear he saw in them, nor anger, nor pleading. It was a terrifying void, a place where the soul had retreated so far inward it had left the windows vacant. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stared, her gaze passing through him as if he were nothing more than a ghost. A cold rage, clean and sharp, cut through him. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a heavy file from his saddlebag. "I am going to get you out of this," he said, his voice a low rumble. Unused to speaking to anyone but his horse, she did not react. He set to work on the bolt holding the chain to the post. The rasp of metal on metal was the only sound in the barn, a harsh, rhythmic protest. The iron was thick, the bolt rusted tight. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold. He worked with a focused intensity, his knuckles scraping against the rough wood. All the while, she watched him with those hollow eyes, her breathing a shallow, barely perceptible whisper of air. Finally, with a loud crack, the bolt gave way. The chain fell to the dirt floor with a dead clatter. She remained where she was, as if still tethered by a phantom shackle. Eli shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat. It was old and smelled of leather, wood smoke, and horse. But it was warm. He moved carefully, as one would approach a cornered wolf, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She was lighter than a child, a collection of sharp bones and icy skin. As the heavy wool settled around her, she flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, the first real reaction he had seen from her. He scooped her up into his arms. It was like lifting a bundle of dry sticks. Her head lolled against his chest, but her eyes remained open, fixed on some distant point of horror only she could see. For a moment, he thought of redemption, of the doctor or the sheriff, but the trapper's words came back to him. The coyotes can have what's left. They did not want her. She was a piece of refuse, a problem someone else had made. Taking her back there would be like returning a lamb to a slaughterhouse. Without another thought, he carried her out of the barn's suffocating darkness and into the stark, clean cold. He settled her in front of him on Boulder's saddle, her small frame enveloped in his coat, and urged the horse toward the high country, toward the only sanctuary he knew. The journey to his cabin was miles of slow, steady climbing into the foothills. The world grew quieter, the landscape more severe. He held her steady, his arm a solid bar across her waist. She did not move, did not make a sound. She was a dead weight in his arms, her silence more profound than any scream. He could feel the desperate, fragile beat of her heart against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a ruined cage. He wondered what horrors had silenced her, what cruelty had emptied her eyes. He did not want to know the details. He just wanted to undo the damage. A fool's errand, he knew, but one he could not turn away from. His cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It stood in a small clearing, protected on 3 sides by a thick stand of pine and on the 4th by a sheer rock face. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a place to keep the world at bay. A curl of smoke drifted from the stone chimney, the last embers of his morning fire. Inside, he laid her gently on his own cot, a simple rope bed with a straw-stuffed mattress. The cabin consisted of a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, a small cook stove in the corner. It was a sparse, masculine space, clean but unadorned. She immediately curled into a tight ball, pulling the blankets up until only the top of her matted head was visible. He did not try to speak to her again. Words were useless now. He stoked the fire until it roared to life, chasing the shadows from the corners and filling the small space with a dry, crackling warmth. He put a pot of water on to heat and found a clean cloth. For the next few days, they lived in a world of silence. He moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, his large frame seeming to take up less space than it should. He left a bowl of thin broth on the small stool beside her bed. Hours later, it would be untouched. He left a change of clothes, one of his own flannel shirts and a pair of wool trousers, far too big for her but clean and warm. They lay folded where he had left them. She remained under the blankets, a silent, unmoving mound in the corner of his life. At times, he would catch a glimpse of her eyes, watching him from the darkness of her cocoon, wide and wary. If he made a sudden move, or if his shadow fell across her, she would flinch and disappear completely. He learned to move slowly, to announce his presence by clearing his throat or humming softly under his breath. He treated her as he would a foal that had been spooked, giving her space, showing her with every action that he was not a threat. He cooked for her, simple things he knew how to make. Stews thick with game and root vegetables, skillet bread baked over the fire. He would eat his own portion at the table, his back to her, leaving her plate on the stool. Sometimes, when he woke in the pre-dawn chill to stoke the fire, he would see that a small portion of the food was gone. It was the only sign she was still tethered to the world of the living. He spent his days outside, chopping wood, checking his traps, tending to his animals. The work was a comfort, its physical demands a welcome distraction from the silent, wounded ghost who now occupied his cabin. But he was always aware of her. He found himself rushing through his chores, an unfamiliar urgency pulling him back toward the cabin. He would stand outside the door for a moment, listening, before pushing it open, half expecting to find her gone, or worse. But she was always there, a still point of sorrow in his quiet world. He did not know what to do. He knew how to set a bone, how to stitch a wound, how to track a predator for miles. He did not know how to mend a broken soul. All he could offer was the warmth of his fire, the food from his larder, and the silent promise of safety. On the fourth night, a deep cold settled over the mountains, and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. He had finished his dinner and was cleaning his rifle by the firelight. He glanced over at the cot and saw that she was not there. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the small room. He found her by the cabin's single window. She had thrown one of his blankets around her shoulders and was standing there, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a full moon. The world outside was a canvas of silver and black, beautiful and deadly. She was utterly still, a silhouette of sorrow against the glass. He watched her for a long time, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. Her lips were moving, forming silent words. He strained to hear, but there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. It looked like she was praying, though he could not imagine what she might be praying for. Rescue or release? He took a hesitant step toward her. The floorboard creaked under his weight. She did not startle. She simply turned her head, her face half hidden in shadow, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. They were no longer empty. There was something in them now, a flicker of awareness, a deep and fathomless sadness. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, her lips parted, and a sound, fragile as a dry leaf, whispered into the quiet of the room. It was just one word. Seraphina. The name was like a prayer itself. It hung in the air between them, precious and strange. It did not fit this harsh place. It was a name for lace and gardens, for a world she had lost, or perhaps one that had never existed at all. He could only nod, his own name feeling too rough and plain to offer in return. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the way her small frame trembled under the weight of that single word. He watched as she turned from the window and retreated back to the cot, pulling the blankets over her head once more. Eli stood by the fire for a long time, the name Seraphina echoing in the silence of his mind. He looked at the closed door. and then at the mound of blankets on his cot. He could not stay in here tonight. He could not risk frightening her, could not risk shattering the fragile, tentative trust she had just shown him. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a spare blanket, and picked up his rifle. He stepped outside into the biting cold, pulling the cabin door shut with a quiet click. He settled himself on the rough-hewn porch, his back against the solid log wall, the rifle across his lap. The snow fell in silent, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in white. He sat there, a sentinel in the frozen darkness, guarding the cabin and the broken woman within. The sound of her name a solitary point of warmth in the vast, cold night. The ghost of her name lingered in the cabin long after she had spoken it. Serafina. In the days that followed her whisper in the moonlight, a subtle change began. She was no longer a static mound of blankets, a fixed point of misery in the corner of his life. She began to drift through the small room, a wraith in his oversized flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up a dozen times to free her slender hands. Her presence was almost soundless. He would turn from the fire to find the dirt floor had been swept clean with a makeshift broom of pine needles. He would come in from the cold to find the spare blanket, the one he had used on the porch, folded with a precision that seemed entirely out of place in his rough-hewn world. She was a shadow with purpose. She never spoke, and she still moved away if he came too near, a quick, flinching retreat that twisted something sharp in his gut. But she began to occupy the space with him, rather than just exist within it. She would sit at the far end of the table while he ate, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes cast down, and she watched him. He felt her gaze on his back as he mended a strap of leather. A quiet, constant surveillance that was neither hostile nor curious. It was the watchfulness of a wild thing trying to determine if the hand that offered food was the same one that would eventually set the trap. The winter deepened, sealing them in. Snow fell for 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless, silent siege that buried the world in a shroud of white. The drifts piled up against the cabin door, reaching halfway to the roof. The world outside became an abstraction, a vast and silent emptiness. The cabin, once his solitary fortress, shrank around them. The air grew thick with their shared breath, the scent of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint, clean smell of the soap he used. Every sound was magnified. The scrape of a fork on a plate, the sigh of the logs settling in the fire, the rustle of a blanket. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a living thing, filled with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of their pasts. One evening, as the wind screamed outside, a particularly violent gust shook the cabin, and a shower of fine snow hissed down the chimney, momentarily dimming the fire. Serafina, who had been staring into the flames, let out a small, strangled gasp and curled in on herself, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The sound was so full of pain it stopped the air in his lungs. He saw her then, not in his cabin, but somewhere else entirely. Her eyes were unfocused, looking at a horror he could not see. The memory had her in its grip. It began not with the barn, but with a promise, a neatly printed advertisement in a Boston newspaper, clipped and saved by the pastor's wife, who had taken her in after her parents were lost to consumption. Wives wanted for the West. Honorable, hard-working men seek virtuous partners to build a new life in a land of opportunity. It had seemed like a message from God himself, an escape from a life of being a charitable burden, of mending other people's clothes and eating other people's bread. The agency was a clean, respectable-looking office with a woman whose smile was as starched as her collar. She spoke of romance, of brave men taming a wild frontier, of building a home and a family under wide-open skies. Serafina, who had known only the narrow streets of the city and the suffocating quiet of the orphanage, had believed every word. She had packed her mother's Bible and her only good dress and boarded a train, her heart a fluttering bird of hope and terror. The journey was a blur of smoke and rattling steel. the world outside the window transforming from green hills to flat, endless plains. At the last stop, a man was waiting for her. Jedediah. He was not like the men in the agency's letters. His eyes were small and close-set, his hands thick and calloused, with dirt permanently ingrained beneath his fingernails. He looked at her not as a prospective bride, but as a man appraises livestock at an auction. He paid the agent who had accompanied the small group of women a handful of coins, his ownership sealed with the clink of metal. The new life began not in a charming homestead, but in a squalid shack on the edge of a miserable, muddy town. The promises of partnership and respect evaporated in the first hour. He wanted a servant, not a wife, a body, not a companion. When her quiet nature and gentle disposition failed to please him, when she flinched from his rough hands and wept at his crude demands, his disappointment curdled into a casual, daily cruelty. The beatings were bad, but it was the cold, methodical way he broke her spirit that was worse. He told her she was worthless, that he had wasted his money, that a dog had more sense. He took her mother's Bible and used its pages to light his pipe, and then, when his own appetites were sated and his debts were high, he began to invite other men to their shack, men with the same dead eyes and rough hands. He would lock the heavy iron cuff around her ankle, the same one Eli had found her in, chaining her to the bedpost. "So you do not get any ideas," he would say with a humorless grin. He had shared her, passed her around like a bottle of cheap whiskey until there was nothing left inside her but a hollow, echoing shame. She had prayed. Oh, how she had prayed. Not for rescue anymore, but for the end, for her soul to simply unhitch itself from her body and float away, leaving the used and broken vessel behind. But God, it seemed, had been looking elsewhere. In the cabin, the memory finally released its grip. Serafina was trembling violently, her face pale in the firelight. Eli had moved from his chair to kneel on the hearth. A few feet away from her, he did not touch her. He just knelt there, a solid, patient presence in the storm of her past. "He told me," she whispered, her voice raw, unused. "He told me I was nothing, just a thing he bought." She looked up at Eli, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I begged God to take my soul. Every night, I begged him to just let me go, but he left me here instead." The words were a confession of the deepest despair. Eli's face was grim, carved from stone by the flickering light. He remained silent for a long time, the wind filling the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "God does not always come when you call," he said. "I learned that a long time ago." He stared into the fire, his gaze distant, seeing his own ghosts in the flames. "I was a bounty hunter. For a time. Before this place, I was good at it. Too good. It turns a man into something cold." He paused, swallowing hard. "There was a man I was tracking, a real bad one. Had a woman with him. Not by her choice. I caught up to them in a canyon, miles from anywhere. There was a fight. He was down. The woman, she was scared. She ran, right into a bad spot. A ledge over the river. It was crumbling. She begged me to help her, but his gang was closing in. I could hear their horses. It was her or me." He closed his eyes, the memory a fresh wound. "I left her there. I took the man I'd come for and I rode away. I told myself it was the only choice, that it was my life or hers. But I can still hear her screaming my name. I never even knew hers." He opened his eyes and looked at Serafina, the guilt of a decade raw and exposed. "I never forgave myself. I came up here to disappear, to stop being the man who would leave a woman behind to die." A fragile understanding passed between them. They were two different kinds of broken, two survivors of different wars, now stranded on the same deserted shore. Her pain was a fresh, gaping wound. His was an old, festering scar. But in that moment, they saw the truth of each other. The days bled one into the next, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun they could not see through the thick, swirling snow. The suffocating intimacy of the cabin pressed in on them. They moved around each other in a careful, silent ballet, their bodies always a few inches from touching, the accidental brush of his arm against hers as he passed her, the fleeting moment her fingers grazed his as she took the plate he offered. Each touch was like a spark, a jolt of awareness that left them both trembling and unnerved. One morning, the storm broke. The world outside was blindingly white, silent and still. The air was so cold it felt sharp. Eli spent the better part of the morning digging a tunnel out of the cabin, the rhythmic scrape and crunch of his shovel the only sound in the universe. Serafina watched him from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. The cold air felt good on her face, clean and real. He had worked his way to the woodpile and began splitting the logs he had stacked there, needing to replenish their dwindling supply. The work was hard, and soon he shrugged off his heavy coat, then his wool shirt. He worked in just his trousers and undershirt, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing with each powerful swing of the axe. Steam rose from his body in the frigid air. Serafina found she could not look away. His back was a landscape of its own, crisscrossed with old scars, a long, thin one that ran parallel to his spine, a pock-marked cluster on his shoulder. These were the marks of his old life, a testament to the violence he had survived. She saw not ugliness, but strength, a strength he had used to break her chains, to carry her here, to guard her through the night. Her eyes lingered on the powerful curve of his shoulders, the way his breath plumed in the air, the sheer, solid presence of him. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed deep inside her, a feeling so long dead she did not recognize it at first. It was a flicker of life in a place she had thought was only ashes. It terrified her. She retreated back into the cabin's shadows before he could turn and see her looking. That night, the tension was a wire stretched taut between them. She could feel the memory of his body, the image of him in the snow, imprinted behind her eyes. He was quieter than usual, as if he, too, had felt the shift between them. She waited until he had banked the fire for the night and was about to retreat to his makeshift bedroll on the floor. "Eli?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, turning to face her. She stood by the hearth, her small frame looking impossibly fragile in the dying light. She was trembling, but her gaze was direct. "My body," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "It is not mine to give. It does not belong to me anymore." The words were a bitter truth, an acknowledgement of all that had been stolen from her. "But my soul," she took a ragged breath, "my soul wants to be warm again." It was the bravest thing she had ever said, an offering of the only part of her that had not been touched, had not been soiled, a plea for a heat that had nothing to do with fire. Eli stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He understood. He understood everything she was not saying. He walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped in front of her, so close he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. He did not reach for her waist or her shoulders. Instead, he reached down and gently, reverently, took her hand. Her fingers were bird-boned and cold. He wrapped his large, calloused hands around hers, cradling it as if it were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. "Then we start with warmth," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He led her to the fire and sat her down on the worn bearskin rug he kept on the hearth. He added a few small logs to the embers, and they obediently caught, sending a fresh wave of heat and light into the room. He sat down beside her, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. He kept hold of her hand, his thumb stroking gentle circles on her knuckles. And there they sat, side by side in the flickering light of the fire. The storm outside quiet for now, the storm inside just beginning. They were both trembling, but for the first time, it was not from the cold. The night they sat by the fire, side by side, His hand covering hers marked a quiet turning point. It was as if a long frozen river inside Serafina had begun to thaw, not with a great, cracking roar, but with a slow, almost imperceptible melt. The next morning, she emerged from under the blankets and, without a word, took the clean clothes Eli had left for her days ago. She dressed behind a blanket he held up for a privacy screen, her movements hesitant. The wool trousers were vast on her, held up only by a length of rope he provided, and the flannel shirt swallowed her whole. But they were warm, and they were clean. They were his. Wearing them felt less like putting on clothes and more like wrapping herself in the safety he represented. Her voice, when it came, was like a long disused instrument, quiet and reedy. At first, it was just questions, dropped like small stones into the vast pool of their silence. "What is your horse's name?" she asked one afternoon, as she watched him brush the big roan down outside the window. "Boulder," he answered, not turning around. "He's as stubborn as one—" "Another day, watching the snow pile against the glass," she whispered. "Will it ever stop?" "It always does," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to outlast it." Her questions were always about the world around them, the horses, the snow, the strange bird call she heard in the mornings. He answered them all with a simple, unadorned honesty. Then one evening, as he sat cleaning a newly set trap, she asked a new kind of question. "Why did you stop?" He paused, his hands stilling. "Stop what? Being a bounty hunter?" He looked at her then. She was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of chicory coffee, her eyes fixed on him with a genuine, searching curiosity. He thought of the woman on the ledge, of the cold weight of the money he'd earned, of the man he had been. "Because one day," he said slowly, "I looked in the mirror and saw the same emptiness in my eyes that I saw in the men I was hunting." She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She was beginning to see the man, not just the rescuer. A few days later, Eli was bringing Boulder back to the small lean-to that served as a stable. The horse, spooked by a rabbit darting from a snowdrift, suddenly reared. Pulling the lead rope from Eli's hand, Eli, caught off guard, stumbled backward and landed unceremoniously in the deep snow, a flurry of white powder puffing up around him. Boulder just snorted, shaking his head as if laughing at the spectacle. From the cabin doorway, a sound drifted out. It was soft, a breathy little puff of air, but it was unmistakable. A laugh. Eli pushed himself up, brushing the snow from his coat, and looked toward the cabin. Serafina stood there, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide as if she had just let a wild bird escape from her hands. The sound had startled them both. A smile tugged at the corner of Eli's mouth, a rare and unfamiliar feeling. He saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks before she quickly ducked back inside. The small, fragile sound of her laughter echoed in the cold air, a more potent warmth than any fire. He began to draw her out into the world he had built. He started with the rifle. He saw the way she watched the door, the way she listened to the wind, the constant, low-humming fear she lived with. "You should know how to use this," he said one clear, cold morning, holding out an old, lighter rifle he rarely used. She shrank back, her eyes wide with terror. "I cannot—" "I will teach you," he said gently. "Knowing how to do a thing gives you power over it. Fear is just a shadow. You give it substance when you run from it." He was patient. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder. His hands guided hers, but never gripped, his touch light and instructional. The first time she pulled the trigger, the explosive crack made her cry out and drop the rifle in the snow. She stood trembling, her face as white as the drifts around them. He did not push her. He simply picked it up. "Again," he said softly. They practiced every day. Slowly, her terror subsided, replaced by a grim focus. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. The day she hit the tin can he had set on a distant stump, a fierce, unfamiliar pride lit her eyes. It was the first thing she had controlled in a very long time. He taught her how to ride, not on Boulder, but on a gentler mare he kept. He walked beside her, his hand on the bridle, his voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement. He taught her how to mend the split-rail fence where the snow had weighed it down, showing her how to use the tools, how to knot the wire tight. He was never demanding, never impatient. He was simply offering her pieces of his world, pieces of himself, letting her take them at her own pace. One morning, he woke to a strange smell in the cabin. Smoke, but not from the fireplace. He sat up to see Serafina by the cook stove, a dusting of flour on her cheek, a look of intense concentration on her face. A cast-iron skillet was on the heat, filled with misshapen lumps of dough, some of which were blackened around the edges. She had tried to make biscuits. He sat at the table and waited. She brought a plate over and set it down without a word, her eyes fixed on the floor, bracing for his judgment. He picked one up. It was heavy as a rock and slightly burnt on the bottom. He took a bite and chewed thoughtfully. It was, without question, the worst biscuit he had ever eaten. He looked at her. She was watching him from under her lashes, her whole body tense. "They're awful," he said, his voice perfectly serious. Her face fell. A flicker of the old shame crossed her features. He took another large bite. "I'll have 2 more," he added. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was the first real smile he had seen from her. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, like a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a stone. Their tentative peace was shattered one night by a storm that rolled in from the plains. It was not a snowstorm, but a violent, angry squall of thunder and lightning. The sky was split by jagged flashes of white, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the very logs of the cabin. With the first great clap of thunder, Serafina cried out, not a word, but a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She scrambled from her cot and huddled in the darkest corner of the cabin, her hands over her ears, her body curled into a tight ball. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had broken inside her. The loud, violent noises, the flashes of light, they had thrown her back into the darkness of her past, into a world of shouting men and unpredictable violence. Eli was by her side in an instant. He knelt in front of her, trying to break through the wall of her panic. "Serafina," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "It is just the storm. You are safe here." She did not seem to hear him. She was shaking uncontrollably, lost to the memory. He did the only thing he could think to do. He reached out and gathered her into his arms, pulling her trembling body against his chest. He did not stroke her hair or whisper comforting platitudes. He simply held her. It was not a lover's embrace, not an act of passion, but the hold of an anchor in a raging sea. He made his body a shield, a wall between her and the storm, both outside and in. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs, could feel the frantic, shallow gasps of her breath. He just held on, waiting for the worst of it to pass. Slowly, as the thunder rolled away into the distance and the lightning flashes grew less frequent, her trembling began to subside. Her breathing deepened. She became aware of where she was, of the solid warmth of his arms around her. She did not pull away. She sagged against him, utterly spent. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the gentle drumming of rain on the roof. Her face was buried in his shirt. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice muffled against his chest. "If you kiss me," she whispered, the words trembling with a fragile, desperate honesty, "I'll break." He felt the words like a physical blow. He understood. A kiss was not just a kiss. It was an act of possession, of claiming. It was what those men had done before they took everything else. He tightened his hold for a fraction of a second, a silent reassurance. He leaned his head down, his lips close to her ear, his own voice a low, rough whisper. "Then I will not," he promised. "Not until you ask me to." He had given the power back to her. He had seen the broken pieces of her and had not tried to force them together. He was content to simply hold them until she was ready to start mending them herself. The days that followed were different. A new kind of quiet settled between them, less about fear and more about a deep, unspoken understanding. He had seen her at her most broken and had not turned away. A week after the storm, they were standing by the fire. He had just come in from checking on the animals, and he was brushing the last of the snow from his coat. She was mending a tear in his shirt, her head bent over her work, the firelight catching the soft curve of her cheek. She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw a look he had never seen before. It was a mixture of fear and resolve, of sorrow and a powerful, undeniable longing. She put the shirt down, stood up, and walked over to him. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could see the flicker of the flames reflected in her pupils. She raised herself on her toes, lifted a trembling hand to his jaw, and pressed her lips against his. It was a kiss that held a lifetime of pain. It was hesitant and uncertain, the kiss of someone relearning a language she had only ever heard spoken in violence. But beneath the sorrow, there was a current of profound longing, a desperate need to connect, to feel something pure. It was a question and an answer all at once. Eli did not move. He did not kiss her back. He simply stood there and received it, an honor and a burden, letting her take what she needed, letting her lead. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with tears. She did not say a word. She turned and went back to her cot, pulling the blanket over herself, but the space between them was forever changed. That night, after the fire had burned down to embers, she spoke from the darkness. "I cannot sleep." Her voice was small. "The nightmares." He understood. He got up and added a log to the fire. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will sleep here, on the floor." "No," she said quickly. I do not want to be alone." He looked at her cot, then at his own bed. He knew what she was asking. It was not for passion, but for protection, a sentry against the ghosts that haunted her sleep. He nodded slowly. He pulled back the blankets on his own bed and lay down on his side, his back to the room. He heard the soft rustle as she left her cot and slipped into the bed behind him. The mattress dipped with her slight weight. She lay stiff as a board, a chasm of space between them. But as the night wore on, and the deep quiet of the mountains settled around them, he felt her move closer, seeking his warmth, until her back was just barely brushing against his. He did not move a muscle. He just lay there, breathing in and out, guarding her sleep. She began sleeping in his bed every night. They never touched, save for the accidental brush of a hand or a foot in the night. It was an arrangement of silent, mutual trust. One night, as they lay in the darkness, she reached out and her small hand came to rest on his arm. Her touch was feather-light. "I want to feel alive," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "He made me feel like I was already dead. I want to feel alive again." He turned over slowly to face her. In the dim glow of the embers, he could see the glistening tracks of tears on her cheeks. He saw the raw, desperate plea in her eyes. It was not a seduction. It was a prayer. She was asking him to help her reclaim the body that had been turned into a prison. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was slow, tender. This was not about his needs, his desires. It was about hers. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a soft, reverent press of his lips against her skin. He moved slowly, his hands mapping the forgotten language of her body, not with demand, but with a quiet, patient reverence. He was unchaining something deep inside her, something that had been locked away in a dark, cold place. For her, it was not an act of passion, but of resurrection, a quiet reclaiming of her own skin, her own senses. It was a prayer answered in the dark. When it was over, she did not speak. She turned her face into his shoulder and wept, not the hysterical sobs of the storm, but a deep, silent, cleansing weeping for everything she had lost and everything that was, impossibly, beginning to be found. He held her, stroking her hair, letting her cry until she had no tears left. He held her as if she were sacred, a survivor of a terrible shipwreck he had found washed ashore. And he would not let the tide take her again. The next morning, Eli woke first. He lay still, watching her sleep, in the pale morning light. Her face was relaxed, free from the lines of fear and sorrow that usually marked it. She looked younger, peaceful. He rose quietly and rebuilt the fire. A short time later, she woke. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she rose from the bed, and for the first time, she walked not to the shadows, but to the cook stove. She began to prepare their breakfast, moving with a new, quiet confidence. And as she worked, a soft, almost inaudible sound filled the small cabin. She was humming, a simple, nameless tune, but it was the most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. The snow did not vanish, but rather surrendered. It retreated slowly from the cabin's clearing, shrinking away from the strengthening sun, its retreat marked by the emergence of damp, dark earth that smelled of life and stone. The constant trickling whisper of melting ice replaced the profound silence of winter. It was the sound of the world waking up. With this great thaw came a new light, a golden, hopeful wash of it that streamed through the cabin window in the mornings, painting stripes across the wooden floor. Seraphina bloomed in that light. The ghost who had haunted the cabin's corners was slowly being replaced by a woman. The oversized clothes Eli had given her no longer looked like a costume, but simply like her clothes. She moved with a growing confidence, her steps nearly silent but no longer tentative. She learned the rhythms of the cabin, of Eli's life, and wove her own into them. The quiet humming he had heard that first morning became a more frequent companion to her chores. Sometimes, while kneading dough or mending a seam, she would sing softly, old hymns from her childhood, her voice thin but clear as meltwater. The fear had not vanished. Eli would still see it flicker in her eyes when a branch snapped too loudly outside, or when his shadow fell upon her unexpectedly, but it no longer ruled her. He saw her smile more often, a genuine, quiet curve of her lips that made his heart ache in a way he did not understand. She was learning to live in the present, to find small pockets of peace in the new life they were building, day by quiet day. The world inside their small cabin had become a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of warmth and healing. But spring melts the snow for everyone. The trails that had been impassable were now open, and the world they had hidden from was once again within reach. He came on a Tuesday. The sun was bright, and Seraphina was outside for the first time, tentatively tending to a small patch of earth near the door where she hoped to plant some herbs. Eli was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a comforting beat in the quiet air. He saw the rider first, a dark speck moving along the trail below. He paused, his hand resting on the axe handle, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Visitors were not a feature of his life. The man rode a sway-backed nag, and as he drew closer, Eli saw he had a weaselly, sunburnt face and wore a hat that was too small for his head. He reined in a few yards from the cabin, his eyes darting around, taking in the scene before landing on Eli. His gaze slid past him to Seraphina, who had frozen by the cabin door, her face paling. A slow, unpleasant grin spread across the man's face. "Well now," the man said, his voice oily. "Looks like the little bird found a new cage." Eli stepped forward, placing himself between the man and Seraphina. He kept his voice low, a dangerous rumble. "You have business here?" "I might," the man said, ignoring him and keeping his eyes fixed on Seraphina. "A friend of mine, Jedediah, He's missing some property. Paid good money for it, too. A mail-order bride. Pretty little thing. Dark hair. Looks a lot like her. He gestured with his chin toward Serafina. She is not property, Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. The air crackled with a sudden, cold violence. And she does not belong to anyone. The man, Caleb, finally looked at Eli, his grin faltering slightly at the look in Eli's eyes. Now hold on. A deal's a deal. He paid for her. What happens to her after that is his business. He wants her back. He is not getting her back, Eli said. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the mountain behind him. Jedediah and his friends ain't the type to take no for an answer, Caleb warned, his confidence returning. They'll come looking. Might get messy. Eli took another slow step forward, his knuckles white on the axe handle. Get off my land, he said, the words as sharp and cold as ice. You tell Jedediah, you tell his friends, that she is under my protection. If I see you or any other man on this trail again, I will not be so kind. Caleb looked from Eli's face to the axe in his hand and seemed to make a calculation. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Your funeral, he muttered, pulling on the reins to turn his horse. He cast one last, lingering look at Serafina before kicking the nag into a trot and heading back down the trail. Eli stood there for a long time, watching until the rider was gone, the axe still clenched in his hand. The peaceful morning had been shattered, the ugly reality of the world intruding on their sanctuary. He finally turned. Serafina was gone. The cabin door was shut. Inside, she was leaning against the closed door, her hands pressed flat against the rough wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard every word. Property. Paid for her. Wants her back. The words were like brands, searing the old wounds open again. The fragile sense of self she had been building crumbled into dust. She was not Serafina. She was a piece of property, a problem, a danger. And now she had brought that danger to the one person who had shown her kindness. She looked around the small cabin, at the fire in the hearth, at the bed where he had held her, at the table where they had shared their silent meals. It was the only safe place she had ever known. And she was going to be the reason it was destroyed, the reason he was harmed. The thought was unbearable. That night, she waited. She lay in the bed, perfectly still, her breathing even, pretending to be asleep. She listened as Eli's own breathing deepened into the slow, rhythmic pattern of sleep from his bedroll on the floor. The weight of his presence, which had once been her greatest comfort, was now a source of profound guilt. He was guarding her, but in doing so, he was putting himself in the path of men who had no honor, no mercy. She could not let that happen. She would not be the woman he was left behind to die for. When she was certain he was asleep, she slipped out of the bed. Her movements were utterly silent. She pulled on the sturdy boots he had found for her, a pair left behind by some long-gone traveler. She wrapped herself in a blanket. She did not take any food. She did not take the rifle. She was not running to survive. She was running so that he would. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, and looked back at his sleeping form. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek. Forgive me, she whispered into the darkness. Then she opened the door and slipped out into the cold, moonless night. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket. The trail was a faint suggestion, more felt than seen. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock, but she pushed on, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cabin. The cold seeped into her bones. Sobs began to rack her body. Silent, gut-wrenching spasms of grief and fear. She was not just leaving him. She was leaving the only hope she had ever known. She was walking back into the emptiness. A twig snapped behind her. Loud, close. She froze, her blood turning to ice. A hand fell on her shoulder, firm and inescapable. She cried out, a thin, terrified sound. Serafina. His voice, She sagged with relief and a fresh wave of despair. He had found her. He turned her around, his hands on her shoulders. Even in the profound darkness, she could feel the fury and the fear radiating from him. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "I have to go," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "He is coming for me. They will hurt you. It is my fault. I cannot let them hurt you because of me." He did not argue. He did not reason with her. He simply bent down and scooped her up into his arms, blanket and all, and started walking back toward the cabin. He held her tight against his chest, his strides long and angry. She was so light, so fragile. The thought of her out here alone, walking toward God knows what, filled him with a terrifying, primal rage. He did not put her down until they were back inside. The door bolted securely behind them. He set her on her feet in front of the dying embers of the fire. "Do not you ever do that again," he said, his voice shaking with a raw emotion she had never heard from him before. He grabbed her by the arms, his grip just short of painful. He was not angry at her. He was terrified. "Do you hear me?" She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. "I am not afraid of them," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "I am not afraid of Jedediah or any man like him. But losing you—" His voice broke. He took a ragged breath, the confession torn from the deepest part of him. "Do not you dare leave. If you go, I will have nothing left." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was not just her protector. She was not just a wounded bird he had taken in. She meant something to him. In his eyes, she saw his own loneliness, his own desolation. He was not keeping her here out of pity. He was keeping her here because she was the anchor in his own storm. "I love you," she whispered, the words tasting strange and new on her tongue. It was a truth that had been growing in the quiet spaces between them, a truth she had been too afraid to acknowledge. "I am so scared to love anyone. I do not know how. But you make me want to live." His grip on her arms loosened, his hands sliding up to cup her face. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. He leaned down and kissed her. It was nothing like their first kiss. There was no hesitation, no sorrow. It was a kiss of desperate, hungry relief, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving and had just been given bread, of a man who had been dying of thirst and had just been given water. This time, when he led her to the bed, it was not for safety or for comfort. It was for a communion of two souls who had found each other in the wilderness. There was no pain, no memory of past horrors. There was only the solid, warm reality of him, of them. Their coming together was not a quiet, healing act, but a fierce, passionate celebration of being alive. There were tears, but they were tears of release. There was laughter, soft and breathless in the dark. It was a confirmation of the words she had spoken. He made her want to live, and in his arms, she felt more alive than she had ever been. She lay curled against him afterward, her head on his chest, her hand spread over the steady beat of his heart. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was overshadowed by a new, powerful emotion, love. "In your arms," she whispered into the darkness, "I feel whole." In the morning, they talked, not about the men who might be coming, but about the future. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine a life beyond the next sunrise. "We cannot stay here," Eli said, his voice practical, but his hand was stroking her hair, a gesture of profound tenderness. "He knows where we are now. They will come back." "Where will we go?" she asked, a flicker of the old fear in her eyes. "West," he said. "Further west. Oregon. Maybe. Somewhere no one knows our names. We can find a piece of land, build a real home." He paused, then looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "I want to marry you, Serafina, properly, in front of a preacher. I want you to be my wife." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. To be a wife, not a possession. To be chosen, not bought. It was the dream she had thought was dead and buried. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Hope was a dangerous, beautiful thing. They spent the next 2 days making plans, a current of excited energy running between them. They would pack only what they could carry on the horses. They would leave at the end of the week. They spoke of the future in low, happy tones, like conspirators planning a great adventure. The shadow of Jedediah and his men still lingered, but it seemed far away, a threat from a different world. They were in the cabin, packing a sack with dried meat and hardtack, when the dog started barking. Not Eli's old hound, who had passed a year ago, but a stray who had been hanging around, drawn by the scent of food and the promise of a kind hand. It was a frantic, furious barking. Eli went still, his hand reaching for the rifle he always kept propped by the door. He looked at Serafina, his eyes dark with a sudden, terrible certainty. "Get in the root cellar," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Now, do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She stood frozen for a second, her heart seizing with terror. Then she saw the grim resolve in his face, and she moved. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats thundered into the clearing. Not one horse, several. A man's voice, coarse and cruel, a voice she would never forget, cut through the air. "We know you are in there, Eli, and we know who you have with you. Send out what belongs to me, and we might just let you live." It was Jedediah. Her past had found them. The hope they had so carefully built was about to be burned to the ground. The world outside the cabin door exploded. The first gunshot was a deafening crack that echoed off the mountainside, a sound that ripped through the peaceful air and tore a hole in Serafina's world. From the cramped, musty darkness of the root cellar, she heard the splintering of wood as the bullet punched through the door. Another shot answered it from within the cabin, Eli's rifle speaking with a deeper, more authoritative boom. She huddled in the corner, her hands over her ears, her body trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. Every sound was a new torment. The guttural shouts of men, their voices laced with a cruel, vicious excitement. The heavy thud of a body hitting the cabin's exterior wall. The crash of glass as the single window was shattered. She could hear Eli's movements above, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the controlled economy of his actions. He was not panicked. He was fighting. He was a man who knew the brutal arithmetic of violence. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out. But the sounds were burned directly into her mind. She heard a man scream, a high, thin sound of agony that was cut short. She heard the splintering of the door as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. The fight had moved inside. The sounds became more intimate, more terrible. The heavy grunts of exertion, the sickening wet thud of fists meeting flesh, the crash of the table being overturned. Above it all, she could hear Eli's ragged breathing, the sound of a man pushing his body past its limits. Then came a sound that made her own heart stop. A gunshot, but this one was different. It was inside the cabin, muffled and heavy. It was followed by a sharp, grunting cry of pain that she recognized with a sickening lurch of her soul. It was Eli. A heavy silence fell. It was more terrifying than the noise. In the quiet, she could hear a man's labored breathing, and the slow, heavy drip, drip, drip of something wet hitting the floorboards. "He is done," a voice rasped. It was Jedediah. "Now, where is she? Find her." Serafina held her breath, pressing herself further into the earthen wall of the cellar. She heard footsteps moving slowly, deliberately, around the room above. A boot kicked aside an overturned chair. "Check under the bed," Jedediah commanded. A moment passed. Nothing. Where would he hide her? The footsteps drew nearer to the center of the room, directly over her head. She saw a sliver of light appear as a boot scraped against the edge of the trap door. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. She was a mouse in a box, and the cat was scratching at the lid. The trapdoor was ripped open. Light flooded the small space, blinding her. A man's silhouette filled the opening, a dark, hulking shape against the bright sky. It was Jedediah. His face was bruised, a cut bleeding freely over one eye, but he was grinning, a triumphant, predatory leer. "There you are," he said, his voice a low, satisfied growl. "Like a little rat in a hole. Come on out. We have some unfinished business." He started to lower himself down into the cellar. In that moment, something inside Serafina snapped. It was not courage. It was not strength. It was a primal, desperate instinct. The cornered animal turning to face the wolf. She saw Eli's face in her mind, heard his voice promising to keep her safe. She saw the life they had just begun to dream of being extinguished. The passive girl who endured, the broken woman who wept, was burned away in a flash of pure, protective rage. Her eyes darted around the small space and landed on the long, iron fireplace poker she had knocked over in her haste to hide. Without a thought, she lunged for it. Her fingers closed around the cool, heavy metal. Jedediah was halfway into the cellar, one hand reaching for her, his grin widening. "That is right. Come to—" She did not let him finish. She scrambled forward and drove the pointed end of the poker upward with all of her slight weight behind it. It was a clumsy, desperate motion, fueled by sheer terror. The iron point struck him in the soft flesh beneath his jaw. He let out a choked, gurgling cry of shock and pain, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his throat, trying to pull the poker out. Serafina did not stop. A terrible, keening sound tore from her own throat as she pushed herself out of the cellar, still clutching the poker. He was staggering, trying to draw his pistol, but his hands were slick with his own blood. She swung the poker again, a wild, horizontal arc that connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He went down like a felled tree, his body hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. She stood over him, shaking from head to foot, the poker still gripped in her white-knuckled hands. The room was a wreck. One man, a stranger, lay dead by the shattered window. Another was slumped against the far wall, and Jedediah was still. Then she saw Eli. He was propped against the wall near the fireplace, his rifle on the floor beside him. His face was ashen, his left shoulder and side saturated with a dark, spreading stain of red. He was trying to press a rag to the wound, but his movements were weak, his eyes clouded with pain. The poker clattered from her nerveless fingers. "Eli!" She scrambled to his side, her hysteria breaking free. Sobs tore from her chest as she dropped to her knees in front of him. The sight of his blood, of his pained, shallow breathing, was more terrifying than the violence she had just committed. "You saved me," she cried, her tears falling onto his blood-soaked shirt. She ripped a clean strip of cloth from the hem of her own dress, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. "You saved me. Now I save you." She pressed the cloth to the wound, her small hands firm over his. He winced, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, then his gaze moved past her to the body of Jedediah on the floor. A flicker of something, pride, relief, crossed his face. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, before his eyes rolled back and his head slumped against the wall. Just as a fresh wave of panic threatened to engulf her, she heard it, the sound of more horses, coming fast. Her blood ran cold. They had sent for more men. It was over. She looked from Eli's unconscious form to the rifle on the floor. She did not know if she could use it, but she would not let them take him. She would not let them take her. She was reaching for the rifle when a voice boomed from outside, a voice of authority. "This is Sheriff Brody. Throw down your weapons and come out." A sheriff, hope, thin and reedy, pierced through her terror. She stumbled to the door, her hands and dress stained with blood, her face a mask of tears and horror. A tall, gray-haired man with a worn leather vest and a large mustache sat on a horse in the clearing, a pistol in his hand. 2 other men were with him. He took in the scene, the terrified, blood-soaked woman in the doorway, the carnage inside the cabin, his expression grim and unreadable. "What happened here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calmer now. "They came for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They shot him. They shot Eli." The sheriff dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the dead men inside the cabin. He stopped when he saw Jedediah, his expression hardening. He looked back at Serafina, his gaze softening with something that looked like understanding, even pity. "We heard the gunshots from the valley trail," he said. He looked around the clearing, his eyes missing nothing. He nudged Jedediah's body with the toe of his boot. "Everyone in Redemption knows what Jedediah and his kind did to you. Miss, they knew he bought you and treated you worse than a dog. It is about time someone stopped them." He sighed, a weary sound. "Justice out here is a rough business. Looks to me like it has been served." He turned to one of his men. "Get the doctor from town. The man inside is still breathing. The rest of this trash can wait for the undertaker." Serafina did not wait to hear more. She was already back at Eli's side, whispering his name, pressing the makeshift bandage to his wound, her tears of terror slowly turning into tears of desperate, fragile relief. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The town doctor came, a grim, competent man who dug the bullet from Eli's shoulder and stitched him up with practiced efficiency. "He is strong," the doctor said, packing his bag. "But the fever will be the real fight. It is up to him, and you, now." Serafina did not leave his side. She became his guardian, his nurse, his anchor to the world. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water, spooned thin broth between his lips, and changed his bandages with hands that grew steadier each day. She sat through the long nights, listening to his ragged breathing, her hand resting on his, willing her own strength into him. In his delirium, he would sometimes cry out, not her name, but the name of the woman he had left on the canyon ledge years ago. Each time, it was a knife in her heart, but she would just squeeze his hand tighter and whisper, "I am here. I will not leave you." Slowly, painstakingly, he began to heal. The fever broke one rainy dawn, leaving him weak and spent, but lucid. The first time he opened his eyes and they were clear. The first time he looked at her and truly saw her, a profound, bone-deep relief washed over her. As Eli's body mended, something inside Serafina began to knit itself back together as well. The cabin, the scene of such terror, became her domain. She chose to stay. Running was the old Serafina's answer. The new one stayed and fought, and now she would stay and build. One day, while Eli slept, she found an old, half-used can of whitewash in the lean-to. She spent the entire afternoon painting the interior walls of the cabin. With each stroke of the brush, she felt like she was erasing the shadows, painting over the memories of fear and violence with a clean, bright hope. When Eli woke, the cabin was filled with a soft, reflective light, the air smelling of lime and clean earth. He just looked at her, a world of gratitude in his eyes. She found a small cloth packet of wildflower seeds tucked away in a supply crate. She cleared the small patch of ground by the door, the same spot where she had stood when Caleb arrived, and planted them. She was putting down roots, both in the soil and in her soul. She was no longer a temporary refugee. This was her home. Her cooking improved. The awful biscuits became a memory. She learned to bake bread that rose light and airy. She made stews that were rich and savory. She was not just providing sustenance, she was providing comfort, care, life. The cabin began to feel less like a rough bachelor's outpost and more like a home. Eli watched it all from his bed, a quiet wonder on his face. He saw the way she moved, the new confidence in her step, the way she would sometimes hum as she worked. He had rescued her body from a barn, But here, in his cabin, she had rescued her own soul, and in doing so, she had rescued his. The day he could finally stand on his own, leaning heavily on her for support, was a victory for them both. He walked with a limp, and the doctor said he always would, a permanent reminder of the day's events. They made their way slowly to the small porch, sitting on the rough-hewn bench and watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He was quiet for a long time, watching her face in the fading light. "The sheriff told me what you did," he said finally, his voice still rough. "He said you saved my life." "You saved mine first," she whispered, her eyes on the horizon. He turned to her, his hand covering hers. His was still weak, but his grip was firm. "No, Serafina, you did more than that." He took a breath, his eyes filled with a raw, powerful emotion. "I was a ghost when you came here, hiding from a past I could not outrun. This cabin was a tomb. I was never whole until you walked through my door." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She looked at him, at this strong, broken man who had seen the worst of her and called it beautiful. She saw the love in his eyes, a love that was as solid and real as the mountains around them. He did not need to ask the question. She did not need to give a verbal answer. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not the trembling, sorrowful kiss of their first encounter. It was not the desperate, passionate kiss of the night she told him she loved him. This kiss was different. It was strong, hungry, and certain. It was the kiss of a woman who knew her own heart, who knew her own worth. It was the kiss of a survivor, of a partner, of a future. It was a promise, sealed in the twilight, that their life together was just beginning. The spring that followed their ordeal was not a timid thing. It arrived with a fierce, joyful rush, as if the land itself was taking a great, cleansing breath after the long, hard winter. The sun was a constant, welcome weight on the shoulders. The creeks, swollen with meltwater, sang a boisterous song, and the tall grass in the meadow below the cabin grew thick and green, dotted with the defiant colors of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets. On a day bathed in that warm, brilliant light, Serafina walked through that grass. It swayed around her, brushing against the hem of a pale blue dress she had painstakingly sewn from a bolt of calico Eli had brought back from his last supply run. The dress was simple, but on her, it looked like a piece of the sky. The sunlight caught in her dark hair and warmed her face. And for the first time since she had come west, she felt its heat not as a punishing force, but as a gentle caress. She closed her eyes, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, a smile that reached deep inside and unknotted the last of the old, cold fears. Eli watched her from the cabin porch, leaning against a support post. He no longer needed the cane the doctor had insisted upon, but his limp was a permanent part of him now, a steady, rhythmic reminder of the price of their peace. He did not see it as a weakness. He saw it as the mark of a battle won. He watched his wife. The word still felt new and miraculous in his mind, and a profound sense of rightness settled over him. He had seen her as a ghost in a ruined barn, a trembling survivor in the dead of winter. Now, he saw a woman standing in a field of wildflowers, as vibrant and resilient as the land itself. That afternoon, they rode into redemption. They had not discussed it at length. It was a decision that had formed silently between them, a necessary final step. As they left the high country, the trail widening, Eli reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his without hesitation, their hands clasped together, a simple, undeniable declaration for anyone who cared to see. They were not hiding. They were not ashamed. Their arrival in town turned heads, just as they knew it would. Doors to the saloon swung open. Faces appeared in the windows of the general store. They heard the whispers, the low murmurs that followed them like a trail of dust. The story of the shootout at the reclusive rancher's cabin had become the stuff of local legend. But for every person who whispered and stared with morbid curiosity, there were others who simply nodded, their expressions ones of quiet respect. The sheriff, Brody, saw them from his office and gave a slow, deliberate tip of his hat. Silas, the storekeeper, came out onto the boardwalk and smiled a genuine, gap-toothed smile. They saw not a scandal, but a reckoning. The preacher was a young man with earnest eyes and a slightly frayed collar. He met them in the small, sun-drenched church at the end of the main street. The air inside smelled of old wood and dried flowers. The ceremony was short and simple. There were no guests, save for Sheriff Brody and his wife, who had insisted on standing as witnesses. Eli's voice was a low, steady rumble as he spoke his vows, his eyes never leaving Seraphina's face. When it was her turn, her voice did not tremble. It was clear and strong, each word a stone being laid in the foundation of her new life. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Eli did not kiss her with the fierce passion of their reunion, but with a gentle, profound tenderness that spoke of a lifetime of devotion. Afterward, as they stood in the sunlight outside the church, a small group of women approached them. They were the wives and daughters of the town's blacksmith, its ranchers, its merchants, women who understood the harsh realities of this land. One of them, a stout woman with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, stepped forward. "We heard what happened," she said, her voice direct but not unkind. "What you went through. You are a brave woman." Seraphina was taken aback, unsure how to respond to this unexpected show of solidarity. Before she could speak, another woman, younger and holding a small child by the hand, held out a small, neatly wrapped package. "These are seeds," she said. "For a garden. Every home should have one." An older woman, the sheriff's wife, simply reached out and gave her a firm, comforting hug. "Welcome to redemption," she whispered in her ear. Then she pulled back and added, "I hear you are skilled with a needle. I have more mending than I can handle. If you would be interested in some work." It was not pity they offered. It was acceptance, a place in their world, a chance to be known not for her past, but for her presence. Tears welled in Seraphina's eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of gratitude, of belonging. She looked at Eli, who was watching the exchange with a quiet pride on his face, and she knew they had been right to come back. They rode home as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. They were quiet, the events of the day settling around them like a warm, comfortable blanket. As they neared the cabin, a scruffy yellow dog with one floppy ear trotted out from the trees. It was the same stray that had warned them of Jedediah's approach, a dog that had kept its distance for weeks. It stopped a few yards away, its tail giving a single, tentative wag. Seraphina slid off her horse. "Hello there," she said softly, kneeling down and holding out her hand. The dog whined, a low, hopeful sound, and crept forward, sniffing her fingers before giving them a quick, rough lick. When they reached the cabin, the dog followed them onto the porch. When they went inside, it lay down on the worn rug by the door as if it had lived there its whole life. It had chosen them, and they, without a word, had chosen it. That night, a deep and peaceful quiet settled over the small cabin. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the newly whitewashed walls. The dog snored softly by the fire. Eli lay on the bearskin rug, his head propped on a pillow, staring into the flames. Seraphina lay beside him, her head resting on his good shoulder, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery lines of the old scars on his chest. Each one told a story of a life lived before her, a life of violence and loneliness. She followed the path of one long scar that ran alongside his ribs. "You have so many," she whispered. "Most of them I earned," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A few I deserved." She ran her hand down his chest, over the steady, solid beat of his heart. She thought of the man he had been, the bounty hunter who had left a woman to die, a ghost haunted by his past. She thought of the woman she had been, a purchased thing in chains, a soul so broken she had begged for death. She thought of all the pieces of themselves they had thought were lost forever. Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but it was filled with a profound and certain truth. "You did not just save me," she said, looking into his eyes. "Anyone might have cut the chain, but you did more. You found the part of me no one wanted, the part I did not even want myself, my naked soul, and you carried it home." He turned his head, his gaze intense, and saw the absolute conviction in her face. There was no more pain there, no more shame, only a love so deep and pure it took his breath away. He did not need words. He answered her with a kiss that started with a slow, simmering tenderness and deepened into something else entirely. Their final coming together was not about healing. It was not about reclaiming. It was a celebration. It was a fierce and joyful declaration of life, of love, of two whole and complete souls choosing each other without reservation. It was passionate and open, a dance of two flames who had learned to burn as one. There was no shadow of the past in their bed, no ghosts in the corners of their home. There was only the sound of their breathing, the warmth of their skin, and the undeniable truth of their love. The next morning, Serafina rose early and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains, sending shafts of golden light across the meadow. The dog stretched at her feet before trotting off to investigate a rustle in the tall grass. She stood in the doorway of her home, and watched the wind sweep through the grass, making it move and sway like a great, green ocean. She watched the light spread across the land, chasing away the last of the night's shadows. A smile touched her lips, a peaceful, private smile. She was finally free, and she had chosen to stay. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.